Today in cable episode number 2, we're going to talk about why this XLR cable costs $5 and this XLR cable costs $48. What is up, everyone? My name is DJ Rick Webb, as always, and today, like I said, is cable episode number 2. We're going to be talking about the differences between cheap and expensive XLR cables and everything in between. On the table here, I have 5 different XLR cables. All 5 of these are XLR cables I've used before, and I'm going to explain and we're going to literally dissect and take these cables apart to show you the difference between all of these cables, to kind of give you guys an idea of why this one on my right, or my right, your left, costs $5, and this one on my left, your right, costs $48. First off, we have this $5 generic XLR cable. You can literally pick up 10 of these 25-foot XLR cables for $50. And this was one of the first ever cables that I ever used as a DJ. The second cable on this table right here is this one right here, and just because I was too lazy to go dig out the 25-foot version that I have of this, I have a little 2-footer. But this is GLS audio XLR cables. So this is just the standard GLS audio XLR cable, which was the second XLR cable that I got into when I had these. The next 3 cables on this table are Hosa cables. Big shout out to Hosa for helping me make this video. So the third cable on this table is the standard microphone cable from Hosa. This one normally runs about $19 on Amazon for a 25-footer. I'm comparing prices. Like I said, all of these are going to be 25-foot cable prices, which is actually the XLR cable size that I recommend you get when you're first getting XLR cables. The fourth one on the table is the Hosa Pro Series 25-foot XLR cable, and these things normally run about $25. And then the 5th cable on this table here is basically the Mac Daddy of them all, and that is the Hosa Edge 25-foot extension cord. And these things run a whopping like $48 on Amazon for a 25-foot extension cord. These things are no joke. So like I said, all of these vary in price. So we're gonna find out now why this one's so cheap, this one's so expensive, why these ones are in the middle. We're gonna dive in, we're gonna talk about the gauge of wire they're using, we're gonna talk about the internals, the noise canceling, what all features these have, and we're gonna dissect these cables, and we're going to see why each one of these costs the amount that they do. We're going to first start off with the cheapest cable, so we're going to reposition this camera to get you guys a nice close-up of this cable as we're taking it apart so we can see why this one is so cheap. So right here we have the $5 generic cable, and generic describes this cable very well. We're going to need a screwdriver to take this one apart. Some of these literally you can just unscrew by your hand, but these require a Phillips screwdriver to actually get these apart. Before we actually take this cable apart, I want to talk about some of the reasons why this one is so cheap compared to some of the others. The main thing we're going to be talking about is the connectors themselves, what these connectors are made of, how cheaply made the connectors are, and then we're also going to be talking about the internals of the wire, and when we dissect them, we're going to be talking about the gauge of the wire, not just this external gauge that you can see here, but the gauge of the actual wires that are sending the signal, these 3 wires that are inside, what gauge those are, and also the shielding that is used to prevent noise in your cable. So like I said, this is just a generic cable, so the connectors on the end of this are very generic, Chinese, more than likely made, very low quality, standard, cheap grade connectors. They connect together, they disconnect. One more thing before we actually start taking these apart, I want to point out terminology for you guys in terms of XLRs. You have male and female end connectors. This is the male end, this is the female end. If you've been through health class, you know why this is a male and this is a female. Alright, so to take it apart, like I said, these ones require a Phillips screwdriver, as so do some of these other cables, but we're just going to literally unscrew these. So the way you disassemble these are you literally just slide this back, slide the shielding of the connector back on both ends. So this one will slide back, this one will slide back, and now we can see the internal wiring on these. So if you guys watched my case build part 2, you guys are probably familiar with seeing this soldering, and as you guys can see, this is a very generic and very cheaply made XLR connection. As we get into the more pro-end XLR connections, you guys will see the quality difference in these. As you guys can see, the white, the red, and then the neutral ground here, these wires are pretty thin, and it's just an average solder job. A little bit better than the solder job I would do, but the wires coming into this are pretty thin, and exactly these wires are 24 gauge. Quickly want to give another terminology breakdown for you guys. When I'm talking about gauge, I said that those are 24 gauge. As you guys will see, we'll get into smaller and smaller gauge. What gauge mean is, or AWG is sometimes the terminology used for gauge on the packaging. Gauge means is how thick that white and that red wire are. So we're talking about the metal inside of that white and red wire. That's what's actually transmitting your audio signal. So the bigger the number, the bigger the gauge number, the thinner that internal wire is, the less fibers are in that wire. The lower that number, the bigger that wire is. If you guys mess with home audio speakers, you guys are probably familiar with gauge. And then also with extension cords, you know, we get down into the 14s and the 12s and the 10 gauge wiring, because the thicker the wire, the more power and signal you can transmit down that wire. Basically, that means the lower the gauge number, the more signal you can send down that wire, the better the XLR cable is going to be, and the more expensive it's going to be. So now back to the video. So I actually cut the cable a little bit so you guys can see a little bit closer on this $5 cable. The little silver wrapping you see, that is what they're using to prevent noise from getting into the cable. And you can also see on the back side here, that's the ground cable. I accidentally cut it a little bit, but that copper is your ground cable. And we'll probably see here in some of the other cables that that copper cable actually goes more or less around the whole entire cable and that little bit of shielding there. You can also see how thin the actual rubber itself is on the outside of this cable. And the rubber, for the most part, doesn't really do much. It's more or less there to keep the cable inside intact and makes the cable more durable by having a thicker coat of rubber on the outside. Alright, so that is our $5 XLR cable. Let's move on now to the GLS audio cable to see what's inside of it. Okay, moving on, we have the GLS audio cable. This is a $13 cable, a significant increase in the amount of money you're paying for your cable. And you can see a little bit more of a flexible, looks like a better design overall for the XLR. There's also a rubber seal around the XLR to help prevent dust and stuff from getting into it when it's clipped together. Just overall a better design than the $5 cable. Also, to undo it, we just have to unscrew the back cap and that'll pull back. Now, instead of pulling this part back down this way on this one, it just pulls off the front. So a little bit of an easier design to take it apart than the original. Also, as you notice, we have a clamp here on the back side. Already we're on a better quality because this clamp is what's preventing this back wire from getting bent, getting pulled on. It's got like little metal claws. On the cheap one, there's just this little piece of metal that comes back and then clamps around it. Not as good of a design as this because obviously this clamp holds a lot better. That clamp will slide back, and now we can see the actual GLS audio cable. So now I have both sides of the GLS audio cable taken apart. As you can see, pretty similar design to the $5 cable. They're using black plastic instead of blue plastic. Now when we look at gauge of wire, we can't really see it as well, but one thing that is nice that they're doing is they put heat shrink wrap around all the terminal connections. So that way it's a little bit less likely that these wires are going to touch each other and cause issues down the road. But according to their specs, the gauge on these wires is actually 22 gauge versus that cheap one was 24 gauge. So now let's actually cut into this cable and let's see what is inside. So like I said, when we got into the more expensive cables, what you'll see is that the actual ground wire, which is this copper that you're seeing right here, is the shielding on the wire. There's also fiber in here. I don't know if you can see that, but there is a quilted fiber that also wraps around the cable. A lot more shielding is going on with this cable. Also, the rubber itself is quite a bit thicker compared to the cheap one. So you're getting better shielding, you're getting a copper shielding using the ground wire, and you're also getting some fiber shielding as well. Right there's a good shot of the fiber shielding. But for now, that is the GLS audio cable. We're going to move on now to the standard Hosa XLR cable. This is the Hosa Technology standard cable, and before we even dissect it, we can see right there that the gauge is 22 gauge. The connectors are that standard generic Chinese connector look. So it's going to be curious to see if these have similar internals to that $5 cable, or if Hosa did something to make them higher end quality. These are running about $19 right now on Amazon. Like I said, they're more expensive than the cheap one and the GLS audio cable. Notable on the connector, there is no rubber seal like we saw on the GLS audio that allowed it to seal the dust connection. So as you can see right there, there's a gap in between. The GLS audio has a rubber seal right there that keeps that nice and sealed. Not waterproof, just dust proof and a little bit of dirt proof. I'm pretty sure when we take this apart, we're gonna see that the internals are very similar to the cheap one. Now the cable itself may be different. All right, let's take these apart. So we should be able to just slide these back like we did with the cheap ones, which we can. There's that one, and this one should also slide back. Okay, so like we saw with the cheap one, very similar internals. So I just pulled apart this connector right here, which basically just holds the wire here, just like that white plastic piece did. This is the same as what the cheap cable does, the $5 cable. It just holds the wire there, it clamps it down so that when you pull on the wire, you don't pull on these internal wires on the inside. It puts all the strain off of these connections right here, these really weak connections. It puts it on the actual connector itself and the external part of the cable. So one thing that Hosa is doing differently than the cheap one is they have this piece of heat shrink wrap right here which goes around the cable, which I'm assuming keeps these cables from touching the metal part of this shielding, because if it touches this metal, it's going to ground out this cable. So what they did is they put a little bit of heat shrink wrap here that I can slide back now and actually see the internals of the cable a little bit better. They're actually using a clear wire instead of a white wire, and then they got a red wire like normal. As you guys can see, the gauge there looks very similar to what we saw on the GLS audio. Does look to be a little bit thicker than what we saw on the cheap cable, which according to specs, it should be 2 gauge thicker. So now let's actually cut into this cable and let's see what's internal. I can already tell off the back that ground wire is a lot thicker than what we saw on the cheap cable, probably because we have a heck of a lot more shielding going on. Okay, so I cut into the cable here. As you guys can see, like we thought, there would be a lot of copper shielding going on around here. Like I said, the copper is your ground wire that is used as the shielding. So just looking at this cable, we do see a lot more, at least I see a lot more fiber insulation on the inside of this cable versus what we saw on the GLS. And also, we got to remember, there was no fiber insulation on the cheap one, just that little thin silverish lining. I don't even know what it's made of. It's probably some sort of metal lining that was keeping the noise out. I will be fixing these cables, by the way. I am cutting these cables, but I'm cutting them purely for the video. I will be fixing these and being able to use them after this video. And then the last part we want to point out is how thick that rubber is on the outside. Remember, that is a durability thing. It makes the cable a heck of a lot more durable, and overall just keeps your cable better over the lifetime of the cable. This one is by far the thickest one we have seen yet. And that is our Hosa standard XLR cable. Now guys, I don't know if you can tell on camera, but notably I just want to state that this is by far the thickest cable I have used yet. Just from an external standpoint, the quality, the feel of this cable is definitely been the best out of all these cables. So the big thing you'll see with the Hosa Pro cable, other than that gauge from the external standpoint, is the connectors. These connectors look kind of similar to the GLS audio connectors, but obviously they're blacked out, they're brand new with Hosa. And then you got Reen Silver. These connectors are actually silver plated Reen connectors, and basically that means that these are not no Chinese produced. Well, they could be produced in China, but these have some sort of quality control to them in terms of connectors. They're superior basically in terms of just the generic ones you find, and overall will give you better clarity and better signal. So now let's see what's underneath these, because that's what really matters. These unscrew just like the GLS audio ones do. So I already pulled this one off, and I'm going to pull this one off as well. Just like the GLS audio, they use this plastic connector, which I think works a lot better than that metal one. One good thing about using a plastic versus a metal is that you don't have to worry about a wire accidentally touching that metal connector and grounding out. Basically, very bad for your cable. Plastic won't conduct electricity. Well, it will, but it won't actually short out your cable. So now we can pull these back, and now notably, the first thing that's going to catch your eye here is the gauge of that red and that blue wire. So they use a blue wire instead of a white wire on their Hosa ProLine cables. These are 20 gauge connected cables. Basically meaning these are way thicker than what we were talking about. We're now 4 gauge thicker. We started with 24 gauge, we moved to 22, and now we are at 20 gauge on these cables. They actually took the effort to wrap that whole entire shielding wire in a heat shrink wrap here. This is normally just an open copper line that possibly could get a fray and maybe contact one of these other terminal connectors, but they actually wrapped it in a heat shrink wrap. Pretty nice, good quality feature to have to basically make this cable last a lot longer. Let's cut open the cable, because this is where we're gonna see the biggest difference, because this cable is a lot thicker, like I said, than any of the cables we've actually looked at. Okay, so here we can see the inside of the Hosa Edge Pro cable. As you can see the braided copper lining. So I don't recommend doing this to your cable, but I pulled out some of the fiber strands. There is definitely a significant amount of fiber strands in this one, more than what we've seen in the past cables. And when we bend this back right here, we can see the rubber itself, the thickness of that rubber on the outside. A significant increase in rubber, and like I said, that basically improves the durability of this cable over time. Basically keeps it from flexing too much and protects the internal wires and the internal shielding on these cables. So that is our Hosa ProLine cable. Now we're going to move on to the Mac Daddy of them all, the Hosa Edge cable, costing a whopping $48 for a 28-foot cable. I will tell you guys right now, I'm not looking forward to cutting into my baby cables here, because I love these things. Also, you guys notice I have these cables color-coded and labeled. You can check out the video listed right, I believe it's right there. Somewhere on this video you guys will see a link to the cable cleaning episode, which is the cable episode 1, where we talk about labeling cables and cleaning them and maintenance and all that fun stuff. So this is the Hosa Edge cable. They have Nutrix connectors. What's that mean? That means that this is a legit Nutrix connector. If you guys don't know who Nutrix is, they're the pro end connectors. If you want a connector and you want a pro grade, like high-end connector, Nutrix is where you go. The next thing you're gonna see, these are gold on the inside. They use gold connectors inside of all of the Hosa Edge line cables, basically meaning for a higher awesome signal transfer and all sorts of fun stuff like that, if you don't want me to get too techy. So now let's take apart the Nutrix connector, because we basically discussed that this is a high quality, awesome, and pro end connector. So right there is a better shot that you guys can see of the gold tips on the Nutrix connectors that we find on the Hosa Edge cable. And like before on the higher end cables, we find the plastic shielding or guard, I guess, that protects the cable from getting pulled in and out, and we can pull those back like we have done on all the other cables so far. And actually these will pop off too, so for this case I'm going to pop them off just to make it a little bit easier to see what we got going on here. So as you can see on the cables, they're using white and blue. I'm not really sure which one is supposed to be the red. I'm assuming the blue is supposed to be the red, compared to basically what we see in the other cables. And again, we find 20 gauge wire in this, very similar to what we see in the Pro grade line. So when we look at the connections to the pins, we have these pins that come out and then they're clamped onto the wire. And I'm not really sure how the wire is connected. I don't know if it's soldered or not. I don't think it is. But maybe if Hosa is watching this video, they can actually explain it in the comments down below. Because I've never seen this before. Like I said, this is the first time opening up all these cables. I've never seen a connection like this before. It literally is like the wire is jammed into the actual pin itself. Overall, it looks like the most solid connection I've seen yet. Mostly because the wire is literally in the pin. Like the shielding on the wire goes all the way up to the edge of the pin. And again, they also put a little bit of rubber heat shrink wrap on the shielding wire as they combine it together. You can actually see a good shot there of the amount of insulation they're using. Definitely a substantial amount of insulation being used on this cable. Alright, now the part that I dread doing is cutting this cable open, because this is one of my babies, and it's also $48. Alright, so this is by far the coolest thing I found in these cables. The Hosa edge cable, as you can see there, that copper shielding is weaved completely around the whole wire. Like, there's no gap that you can see into the white insulation on the inside. It's literally pretty much 100% coverage, 100% shielding of the internal wire. And lastly, again, we're gonna look at the gauge on that rubber. As you guys can see there, this one is just as thick as probably the Pro cable. And that is pretty much an in-depth breakdown, dissection of all of these cables. If you're still watching this video, that was a very deep, in-depth breakdown of all these cables, the differences, and I hope that explains to you guys why this cable costs $5 and why this cable costs $48. Now, I know the big question that you guys want to know is, what do I recommend? What do I recommend out of all these cables, and in cables in general, what do I recommend? First off, I want to stipulate that these three cables, the higher end, better quality ones that we're looking at, are made by Hosa. I'm not trying to stipulate that Hosa is the only one making the greatest and latest and greatest cables out there. There's plenty of other manufacturers out there that you can check out that are also making good quality cables. But these are the cables that I had to dissect for you guys and actually observe and look at to see what makes them different. Okay, so what is the cables though that I recommend? $5 cables from China. Throw that in the trash. Don't use it. Okay, so that's in the garbage. We're not going to discuss that. We looked at the quality of the cables. We're just going to move on from there, okay? GLS audio cables. If you guys remember, these are pretty on par with what we found in the Hosa standard cables. Hosa standard, a little bit more shielding, but in terms of ballpark comparison, they're pretty similar. And I would say durability wise, they probably are pretty similar as well. If you're looking for a affordable beginner audio cable, I would recommend either of these ones, the Hosa standard or the GLS audio cable. All these cables are going to be linked in the description down below. Now, moving on to the other spectrum, because I consider these pretty much, these are the high-end professional cables. These are your beginner cables, basically. In terms of the cables that I have here, we have the Hosa Pro and then we have the Hosa Edge line. Overall though, I will tell you guys straight off the back, you don't need Edge. You do not need Hosa Edge cable. I don't even really need Hosa Edge cables. The only reason that I would say you would need a Hosa Edge cable is if you're running very long distances, so like 50, 100 feet, and you are doing high-end sound. For just about 90% of the people that are watching this video that are average mobile DJs like me, Hosa Pro line is by far all you need. Quick recap, beginner cables, pro-end cables. When you want to go for beginner cables, you have a $13 25-foot GLS, you have a $19 Hosa standard cable. These prices may have fluctuated since you guys have watched this video, but basically these are like $5 apart. Good beginner cables, I would recommend either of those. When you're looking at pro-end cables, unless you're doing some really high-end stuff, you don't need the Edge. Hosa Pro line will do you perfectly fine. You're looking at $25 per cable. That's literally half the cost of the Edge. And on that note, guys, I hope you guys learned something today. If you did, leave it down in the comment section below. Also, if I completely butchered something or screwed something up completely, leave it down in the comment section below. That way people know that I messed up. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a big thumbs up. That way you help out the channel, because I really could use some more thumbs up. Thumbs up, help the channel. Also, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button. That way you don't miss out on cable episode 3 and 4 that will be coming out, and the lighting videos that are going to be coming out following this, as well as the gig logs, Fusion Sound lighting updates, all that amazing, awesome stuff coming in the future. Then in self-promo news, if you have not checked out DJ Light Clothing, click the link. It's either right there or right there. I'm pretty sure it's right there though. And guys, like always, my name is DJ Rick Webb. Keep the record spinning, and I will see you guys in the next video.